Well, talking about how the Chinese Communist Party likes to put up this, like they're so powerful, the psychological warfare. When China talks about we're going to take Taiwan no matter what, is that psychological warfare?
Absolutely.
Like that they don't actually mean it. Like that it's not like, oh, well, we definitely need to unify with Taiwan. We will take it no matter what. They want to make it so that everybody else is scared of stopping them from it.
Yeah, they do. That doesn't mean they can. I mean, again, it's, if you array a whole bunch of missiles, including American ones, and say the cost is going to be really high. And this is where India becomes interesting because in Western countries, there is a limited, understandable, limited tolerance for loss. You don't want your people to die. I mean, that's, so it's very easy to rationalize appeasement, right? And maybe they'll eat us last is kind of the way that is often put.
How did appeasement work in Nazi Germany?
Well, that's it. So one country that is actually willing to fight and did fight and lost 20 men is India.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're looking at the whole map of the Indo-Pacific, and not just maritime, but land-based also, India is the only country that has a couple 100,000 troops on the Chinese border. They can open up a second front. They can cause pain very effectively. And they have a will to do it because there's never been, historically, there hasn't been a problem between India and China because there were buffer states. There was Tibet. There were other countries in between India and China. Right. So and that's one of the reasons why Mao did the palm and five fingers thing so that he could, grab that whole try to grab that whole area. But they're in the Indian strategic community, they're talking more and more about, maybe it's time to liberate Tibet again, or at least a huge chunk of Tibet, like 2/3 of it or so. And wow. That implies that there is a willingness to fight because they know what's at stake.
Just to contrast that to the U.S., like in the U.S., it's like, there are people like, should we defend Taiwan? Should we not defend Taiwan? India's talking about taking back parts of Tibet.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
there was
different.
We did that episode where we talked about these people who are writing op-eds about how it's not worth it's not worth sending American soldiers to
die on some rocks or something.
No, well, I mean. Right. That was
South China Sea.
That was Scarborough Shoal. But
but for Taiwan, it's like, well, this could cause a nuclear war, that kind of thing where it's like.
But look at it. If they had been stopped at Scarborough Shoal, we wouldn't be talking about Taiwan.
Yeah.
Right. So if Taiwan falls, what are we talking about next? I mean, again, Grant Newsham wrote that thing. If Taiwan falls, it all goes red. Right. So there are 5 treaty allies in that area. So you don't defend Taiwan. What are you going to do about the Philippines? What are you going to do about Japan?
Yeah, Japan is saying if Taiwan, that's an issue of survival for Japan. That's what the Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso just said.
Yeah.
Right. Which justifies Japan's use of military to defend Taiwan, because Japan sees it as life or death, and Japan, some of Japan's islands are actually quite close to Taiwan, some of its southernmost islands.
Yeah. And Japan actually has very good relationship with a lot of the Pacific Islands. So if you're looking at Micronesia, you're actually better off working U.S. and Japan with the Micronesian countries to give them, alternate economic development alternatives. We already see it in Palau. So Palau is a freely associated state, which means it's an independent country, but it has deep agreements with the U.S. And they've offered a base to the U.S. And the U.S. provided vaccines to all of the freely associated states. So they haven't had the COVID curse.
This has been the Biden administration, correct?
Yeah, it's been consistent through the changed administrations.
Okay.
Yeah. The Trump administration was the first one to put a seat on the Security Council dedicated to Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica. So it was the first one to really say we need to look at the Pacific Islands. And it was part of the understanding of the region that came out of that sort of Matt Pottinger national security strategy. And Pottinger, of course, was a Marine. And the Marines know the last battle in the Pacific very well. It's in their blood. So they know what those islands are strategically and how this is the front line between Asia, and last time it was Japan, this time it's China, and how important they are. So Oceania was front and center in terms of how to construct that strategy. So they were very good at building up those relationships with especially the Micronesian countries. And it's been continued now. And this is why, especially compared to what the U.S. has been doing, you can see the problems that are happening with New Zealand. So the Pacific Deterrence Initiative which is the defense money for defense, has provisions for looking at Oceania. There's a act through I think Blue Pacific. Ed Case out of Hawaii has been pushing this as well. It's bipartisan. So there's stuff happening within the U.S. But the question is how to do it. Do you do it with just Japan in the north? Do you bring in the Quad throughout all of Oceania? And I think it takes a really deep rethink about allies and about who actually is going to be there. I mean, there's something that somebody says, when you go through the window to breach the building, are you sure the guy's going to be behind you to back you up? Right?
I mean, I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about all the things that happened in the Pacific region under Australia and New Zealand's watch, like BRI and all this stuff. Why do you think that happened? Do you think they weren't paying attention? Do you think they were welcoming China coming in?
So there were two factors. One was, I think a lot of them were fine with China coming in for their own economic benefit. They thought these are the sort of decisions that went into Darwin, for example. The other was, and you see it particularly with New Zealand again, is there is a definite arrogance and condescension towards the region. And the idea that, they can handle China and they can handle the Pacific and they know what they're doing and they know the Pacific better than anybody else. And, we're going to broker all these deals and it'll be fine. So I think it was a combination of, arrogance bordering on racism in some cases, combined with not actually thinking China was a serious threat. Yeah, it's ugly. And you asked about how the people of the Pacific see it. And the people of the Pacific, I mean, the ones that I've spoken to, they see the increased interest from China, at least initially, as beneficial because it increases their negotiating position with other countries. So they can get more out of Australia and New Zealand and the US and Japan and stuff by raising the China threat, right? They're not stupid. Yeah, but the problem is once they get sucked into it too much, then there's a problem because at the same time, China's doing something the others aren't, which is pushing in newly arrived Chinese at the base of the economic pyramid. So in a place like Tonga, Chinese have taken over about 80% of the local retail sector. So if you're out in a village on a remote island and there's one shop, it's probably run by somebody from Fujian who has no interest in your country. He's there, he and his family are there for 5 to 7 years, suck out as much money as possible, and then either move to Australia, New Zealand, or go back to China with the cash. So they're not going to give you credit. If you need baby formula for your baby, you're not going to be getting it from the local Chinese shop in the village that's the only village you and your family has ever known forever. So that doesn't engender warm feelings.
Well, so China obviously has made a lot of inroads into these countries, and particularly everything that Australia and New Zealand have done or failed to do is definitely worrying. But from what you're saying, it does sound like there is still a lot of hope in the region for getting them back on the side of democracy against the Chinese Communist Party.
The people of the region are, for the most part, first of all, fundamentally democratic. I mean, the democracy takes different forms, but these are societies where, if you can imagine, if you grew up on an island in Tonga, everybody you've ever dated, everybody you've ever went to school with, every teacher you've ever had, you can run into them at any moment walking down the street.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah. So these are societies that have evolved to be consensual in a very deep way, actually. It's democracy on steroids. It may not look like democracy to us because we're used to kind of these mechanisms, these institutionalized mechanisms of democracy, but they have to get along. Like they have to, which is fundamentally what democracy is, where you kind of the consensus of the people. Right?
That doesn't sound like democracy in the U.S. right now.
No, it's that's it. But it's a different structure, and that needs to be. And the second thing is, most of them are very religious, right? So they're Christian. So again, Tonga, when there were flights, there were no flights in or out of the country on a Sunday. Right?
Oh wow.
Yeah. Oh, they're like no fooling around religious. Okay. So those are two things that China isn't. If the two most important things to you as an individual are faith and family,
Oh, yeah, that's not China.
that's not China. So the natural affinities are there. And this is sort of my argument to colleagues in Australia or New Zealand is what you actually want in those countries is you want people who are difficult to deal with. You want kids who are scared of their parents and parents who are scared of God. And they're going to be hard because they believe in something. They believe in each other and they believe in something bigger than themselves. And the Chinese can't handle that. It's going to be difficult for you, but it's going to be an even playing field. And if you believe in the things you say you believe in, you will win. They will come to you. They will want to work with you because of who you are, right? So help them achieve strategic autonomy. Help them be themselves, strong and independent, and as autonomous as they can be. And believe in the things that you say you believe in about yourself.
And freedom, democracy.
Yeah, and it will be a natural alignment. You don't need to control them. You don't need to break down their defenses like Australia is doing with tariffs and social re-engineering programs, that sort of stuff. If you break down their defenses, the Chinese will come in on that pathway.
So now the trick is for America to do what it says it believes in.
Yeah. America and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and Japan, we need to be who we say we are.
Now, you mentioned Canada there, and through much of this podcast, you've been saying we when talking about the United States. But of course, you're hiding a dirty secret.
Yes, I am. So my dad's a dual citizen. So can I hide under that umbrella? So I'm using we in the royal we context, and I can use the royal we because I'm part of the Commonwealth. So it's more of a Five Eyes we, if I may, or NATO we. Actually, it's not a NATO we. It's a Five Eyes we. So it's us.
Right. So what is Canada's role in all of this?
Zero. Yeah, I tried.
Thank you for your effort.
Yeah, thank you.
So Canada is pretty much not going to be a major player in helping us stop the communist threat.
Well, specifically, I'm talking specifically about the Pacific Islands. Canada's in the process of putting together an Indo-Pacific policy like every other country on Earth. You know, I'm sure Switzerland's putting together an Indo-Pacific policy, like everybody's putting together an Indo-Pacific policy. And there are unique things that Canada can do, actually, because a lot of the internal problems that Pacific Island countries have around customary land ownership and tight societies are actually things that Canadian First Nations have gone through for the last 150 years. So there's a lot of compatibility in those cultures within Canadian First Nations and countries in the Pacific. Resource management, how to deal with colonial oppressors of various sorts.
Which I would have thought New Zealand and Australia would have those things as well, because it seems like they talk about, oh, that was bad, we're different now.
Yeah, you'd think. But then if you look, for example, in New Zealand, who talk about how great they are with the Pacific, 30% of Pacific Island children live in poverty in New Zealand. So if you can't even help your own Pacific Island residents or citizens prosper within your system, how can you justify going to their countries and telling them how they should live, right? And the same is true for Canada. And I'm not saying the Canadian government should do that outreach. I'm saying the people of the First Nations, reserves and whatnot, who've had to deal with the Canadian government, could actually help the people of the Pacific Islands deal with Australia and New Zealand. Right? So there are ways that we could work with the Pacific Islands in a very unique way. One is First Nations. The other is, as a bilingual country, French and English. A lot of the Pacific is English as a second language, and a lot is French as a second language. So we can bridge both. We have in Quebec, the province of Quebec, if you are a French citizen, you can come and do graduate school at the same low cost as a Quebec citizen, Quebec resident. So we actually have a lot of people from French Polynesia and New Caledonia studying in Quebec. So there are these bridges that could be built. But again, it comes down to the political will, the identification, the actually doing what we say we want to do, which is, create a networked world of democracy and openness and transparency where like-minded countries and like-minded people work together for the benefit of all, the security and prosperity of all, and give hope to the world.
But I guess it would be harder for Canada and the UK as members of the Five Eyes. It seems like they don't really have the presence in the Pacific.
Good point to bring up the UK. Well done. So the UK has reopened 3 high commissions in the Pacific.
And they permanently put one of their aircraft carriers there recently.
They've just the Queen Elizabeth has gone into is going into the Indo-Pacific, and they've said I think 2 will be permanently stationed in the region, and they've commissioned a new will commission a new sort of equivalent of a royal yacht, which can kind of float around and do soft power type stuff. So they've reopened Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu, and I suspect one of the reasons is because there's been problems with our other 2 Five Eyes partners in terms of intelligence coming out of the region. This post-Brexit architecture, although it was announced before Brexit, is to find these little leverage points where the UK becomes more useful in an intelligence perspective to the US.
I'm seeing the inevitable end where this is the UK uses the China problem to gain power, and then once again, America is back at war with the UK. Do you see it?
Yeah,
Do you see it?
And then the French sit and go,
It's they're the masterminds all
right.
along.
Well, we'll get back at them by fighting the British, winning, and then not helping the French.
Oh, there you go.
Is that a French Revolution joke?
It's sort of very specific historical reference. Although technically that was before the War of 1812, but we don't need to get it. This is not history unearthed.
Also, the French Revolution is basically a communist revolution. We
Not
don't
yet.
support that.
Not yet. History on Earth. We're do you know what the foundational myth of Canada is?
Huh.
You know what? So Canada's National Day is the 1st of July.
Okay.
1867.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does that date mean anything to you?
Well, July 1st.
Or
makes me think of
1867.
China.
Yeah.
And Hong Kong.
Yeah. Well, we predated that, but yeah.
Yeah, no.
So what was just winding down here?
The U.S. Civil War.
Yeah.
Right.
And Lincoln had said one war at a time. Right? So we were going, oh, okay, just a second. So you finished that one. Are you heading up to us now? And so
John Wilkes Booth was a Canadian assassin.
I think he
History unearthed.
Oh no.
Some of those guys passed through Montreal actually, and Montreal was a center for Confederate financing. And we've discussed this before. We're bad guys. But we had that. So there was the Confederation of several Canadian provinces came together at that time to improve our defense capability against the U.S. So our founding myth is defensive bureaucracy. Like that's Canada's foundation, right? So you're like War of Independence and freedom and all this sort of stuff, and we're like, okay, maybe if we sign these papers, everybody will leave us alone.
Canada's creation is, I hope the U.S. doesn't invade.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we were talking about how the UK and Canada not in the Pacific as much.
Well, except this is the thing. The UK suddenly is. So this is the post-Brexit policy.
But do they have? They don't really have territory in the Pacific.
Pitcairn.
Sorry?
That's the old Mutiny on the Bounty Island. They have Pitcairn Island. They do. They have, as you can see from this map that's currently being displayed, they do have a bunch of old agreements, like the Five Powers Defense Agreements, which allows basing in Malaysia and Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. They have the potential to have strategic architecture in the region. They have soft power in the region, and they have. So this is the thing. There's a bunch of different types of superpower or magic powers in international relations. There's military power, there's economic power, and there's intelligence. And the Brits are very good at that, have been forever. And by putting in these new high commissions, they opened up, when Boris Johnson was foreign minister, he announced 9 new high commissions. They were all in Commonwealth countries, and all of them had a population of less than 2 million. They were little overlooked strategic pivots. And 3 of them were in the Pacific. Eswatini was another one, actually. I think the idea behind it was to say the big boys are back in intelligence. Okay, this is just looking at it from the outside, what the logic would be, and so that becomes more useful to the U.S. So it means that the UK is the most relevant European country in the Indo-Pacific for American decision makers.
And it's not technically European anymore.
Well, that's it. It's outside, but they also become useful for the other Europeans. right? So if they're the ones, because you can go to France, but you can, the Poles might go to the UK if they want to know more about the Indo-Pacific now, as they're starting to engage. There's a lot of weakness on the UK-India relationship, but the UK-Japan relationship is very tight, and we'll see what happens where they decide to base. They're very good in places like Oman and Bahrain. I think they're trying to pick up those levers that were dropped during the EU period and see what they can do in the Indo-Pacific.
And this is to counter China, or are there other factors involved?
So I think it's to become a player again, and that goes with economic development and strategic positioning and that stuff. You need to keep a very close eye on the UK and China because of the city, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the Huawei decision was very encouraging. And the next thing to watch for is whether they'll kick the Chinese out of nuclear infrastructure.
Hey, remember that nuclear power plant that's happening right now that's leaking radiation and the French company wants to shut it down?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Anyone watching from the UK?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, what about Canada?
It's very, very kind of you to keep mentioning this country.
No, we're actually doing it to embarrass you.
Yeah, I can
Oh,
tell.
no. It's 'cause so we've established how the UK is
I
in
brought
the
you
Pacific.
cookies. Didn't that work? Didn't
Maybe-
I brought you the Canadian
No,
cookies?
that's why I'm anxious to hear about what Canada's doing to get pivot points in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific.
Nothing. It's what I'm getting from this.
But there's a lot of potential with those First First Nations people.
We did a quad +1 exercise of submarine hunting. Off of Guam, I think. Yeah.
There you go.
That sounds fun. And
Canada's pulling its weight, and it doesn't have a huge population, so it's not that much weight to pull.
Yeah, we are a huge security vulnerability on your northern flank. I mean, we really are. The Vancouver stuff is off the charts. There's a commission that's been going on looking at money laundering in Vancouver, and one of the RCMP guys who testified was saying 10 years ago, we saw the Chinese triads, the Iranians, and the Sinaloa cartel coming into Vancouver to work together on money laundering and fentanyl and
Yeah.
yeah.
We just did an episode about that.
Yeah,
Here's the thumbnail.
you interviewed
Check it out.
Sam Cooper,
Yeah.
who wrote a book on that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was
That was definitely like a pretty horrifying
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can't secure ourselves. So I'm not quite sure how. Do you really want us to play with you further afield? Like help us help ourselves domestically. And we ordered the Chinese vaccine.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That says something.
We ordered the first we ordered it. We put a down payment on it. And it was only because the Chinese couldn't fill the order that, my sister wasn't getting Chinese vaccines.
Oh, Canada.
Correct.
Well, I
That's-
mean, if they'd waited for the American one, they would have just gotten it for free.
I mean, California ordered Chinese masks, so I'm not sure we have like a.
Yeah, there's a lot of stupidity. But actually, overall, I'd say this. I'm walking away from this podcast more hopeful than I usually do, because it sounds like there's still a lot of things that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely, especially with the Pacific Islands. And a lot of it is just very technical. Like Kiribati, which is one of the countries that flipped to China. If there were direct flights now, if you're in Kiribati, like Tarawa, site of a major battle in World War II, you have to fly south to Fiji and to Australia, New Zealand, usually to connect to the rest. Or your advanced education, advanced healthcare, all that stuff tends to go down through Australia, New Zealand. If the flights went north, they could go to Guam. I mean, it's just technical things like that. Alex Gray wrote an article saying that possibly extend these compacts of free association, like you have with Palau and whatnot, to Nauru, Kiribati, and Tuvalu, and just consolidate north. And a lot of that is said it's really technical. It's Kiribati. I think now the U.S. embassy responsible for Kiribati is in Fiji. But if you switch it to Majuro to the north, and you get the flights going to the north, then it'll happen. It'll happen kind of organically. They don't like being tied into that system. So you give them an alternative, They feel culturally more comfortable in the Micronesian environment anyway. So
what you're calling for is a type of, I don't know, defensive bureaucracy?
Yeah, exactly. As a good Canadian, I'd say a lot can be done with pieces of paper and route maps and whatnot. And if you can get it done right, then you can avoid, the bloody War of Independence.